Good afternoon, everyone. Glad you're with me today. I'm happy to see you. It is Sunday afternoon in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. I am sitting in front of books, and I see Ron Waggoner. I see anti-imperialism. I see that there are many of you here joining me, and we are going to have a lovely, lovely conversation. Great time to be here. Shout out to JT24. Shout out to Shonen Ronin. Shout out to Prometheus. Shout out to Orga Mecca. Shout out to ya. Shout out to Space Communist. Shout out to you. Shout out to Libertas Ertano. Shout out to Peter Irvine. Shout out to Balrog Slayer01. Shout out to Pasta Bazooka. Shout out to Devon Spawn. We're all here. We're all having a great time. Now is the time if you have not already done it. Shout out to Hades. Shout out to Lucas Marshall. Shout out to Ivan Moss. Shout out to Swine Class. Shout out to Unnamed Diet Beverage, which I just drank from. Shout out to Tim. Shout out to Genteel Cat. Shout out to Neon Noir. Wow. Logan Hodge is with us. Filthy Kami is with us. Wow, we are having a great time here. Lodlius Furious is here. Wow. Great time to be alive. Great time to be talking to all of you. Now, if you haven't already done it, now is the time to tweet this out. Say, join Caleb Maupin and the gang. We're having a great time here. Oh my God, did you hear what Caleb just said? Oh my God, watch right now. Tweet this out. Share this as a Facebook status. Make this a bigger conversation. Join in the fun. The more that are here, the more the merrier. Bring all your friends. You want me to talk about something? Well, bring all your friends here. And then get them all lobbying you to talk about it, and there'll be no way to escape it. I'll have to address whatever the issue is. Shout out to Tim, who is talking with us. Shout out to everyone who is with us. Wow, so many things that we can discuss today. I know that there are a few of you, usually about 1 in 5, who are viewing this, who haven't subscribed yet. So if you have not subscribed, hit the subscribe button. And if you are subscribed, click that bell so you get the notifications, so we don't do this alone. The more the merrier. We're having a great time here. I see people wanting me to debate Destiny, which I would be happy to do. I know that there's some talk of that happening, and I would be happy to debate Mr. Destiny, Mr. Steve, whatever his name is, the well-known game streamer. Happy to do it. Shout out to Mao, says Pasta Bazooka. Well, there you go. Yes, we've got plenty to talk about. I know more and more are coming in and joining us. Alex Giovanni is here. Steven Schneider is here. Wow. So many of us. We're having a great time. I've got lots of diet beverage. Unnamed diet beverage, that is. And we are going to jump right into things. Folks, you may not believe me when I tell you this. You may say, Caleb, you're wrong on this one. I agree with you about everything else, but you're wrong on this one. It may be hard for some of you to believe. But you can understand economics. I'm talking to you right now. Yes, you can understand economics. Yes, they've worked very, very hard to convince you that economics is this magical, complicated voodoo science that only people with majestically high degrees and people who've studied at Harvard and Yale, only people that understand all kinds of complicated mathematical equations, only people who have sat inside of the academic ivory tower for decades, only they can understand economics. But what I am telling you right now is that you can understand economics. 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 And furthermore, I maintain the fact that you have been convinced that you cannot understand economics is part of what has led to you being disempowered. The fact that you've been led to believe that what creates economic growth, what does not create economic growth, what causes economic booms, what raises unemployment, what lowers unemployment, what causes rising in the standard of living, what causes decreases in the standard of living. The fact that you've been convinced that you cannot understand that's beyond your comprehension, that when they start talking economics on the news, you just look the other way. The fact that that is what you have been fed is part of the reason that you and the U.S. public and the world global population in general has been disempowered. The belief that you cannot understand economics is something that the billionaire monopolists really depend on. You not being able to understand economics, you thinking that economics is beyond your comprehension, is a way for you to be locked out of the debate about the future of this country. And I believe that you can understand economics. No, I'm not saying that I believe you're going to go to business school or economics school and get a PhD and start giving lectures. No. But I believe that you can understand economics. For example, I believe most of you watching probably have a bank account. You understand how much money is in that bank account. You understand where that money came from. You can understand economics. Folks, I read the Wall Street Journal, and I'm very thankful for the person, good friend of mine, former friend of mine, who got me to think about economics. I studied at the University of Political Science. And political science, sure, there's a lot there. But if you don't understand economics and you don't understand psychology, your understanding of political science is going to be deeply limited. So that said, I was looking today, Wall Street Journal, right? So let me go off on a tangent. You know why I like the Wall Street Journal? Why do I like the Wall Street Journal? Because it is the unfiltered party line of American capitalism. When I open the New York Times, the favored newspaper of intellectuals, I get articles that are tailored toward kind of an elitist kind of person. And they're written with the understanding that the person might already be somewhat critical of the way things are. And they're written in this kind of backtracking, well, you might have a point there, but actually everything's fine. And that's the New York Times. The New York Times is a song and dance for America's intellectuals. It's for people in the United States who think they're smart, and it is written in a way that they'll read it and think that they're even smarter because they read it, and then therefore not be critical of American capitalism and feel like they're smarter than other Americans. It's written for a very small constituency of people, whereas the Wall Street Journal, owned, as Ruben Garcia points out, by Rupert Murdoch, is the unfiltered American party line. When I open a Wall Street Journal article, it tells me, Caleb, this is what American capitalism and the 1% want you to think. Period. Unfiltered. Now, do I believe it? Do I uncritically accept it? Of course not. But it's a lot easier to do my job. If I am looking for the unfiltered American party line, I look in the Wall Street Journal, I read the article, it's in the first paragraph, I understand what I am supposed to think. Period. End of discussion. Right? The New York Times assumes I might have dissident tendencies. The New York Times assumes I might be somebody who thinks he's smarter than other people, and it does a whole tap dance to try and convince me of this and that and all this stuff, and all the writers are trying to show off how great they are. They got written in the New York Times, and they're all trying to show... No. The Wall Street Journal gives me the unfiltered line of the American ruling class. I know what I'm supposed to believe. What I'm supposed to believe as a good, believing, unquestioning, loyal, patriotic American is in the Wall Street Journal. And so it's much easier to read than the New York Times. So that said, and I will get to that, Yosef Ali, I see what you're pointing out and needs to be said. I opened the Wall Street Journal today, and I'm reading, natural gas prices rise for a week, but read the article. Prices have come up after hitting a more than 3-year low this month, as worries eased that there would be too much supply in the market. Oil prices are a little charged for the week after posting wild one-day moves. Go on later in the page. Article about OPEC. Heavy production out of the U.S., now an energy exporter, had raised concerns of a supply glut, and investors may take The lower supply and demand growth forecasts as a sign of weakening consumption as stocks fill. Right? The only major production rise from OPEC nations came from Nigeria, where production rose by 146,000 barrels a day in July, a cartel that allowed certain nation grips. Even with reduced output from Iran under U.S. sanctions and Venezuela, some analysts have suggested that OPEC will need to either more strictly enforce or deepen its agreed cuts to support prices. Folks, behind the scenes, there's something going on. There's something going on behind the scenes that you should all be aware of. Did you see the clip? There's a clip of Donald Trump speaking at one of his rallies a couple weeks ago, and he's talking about how the USA is now the world's biggest energy producer. We're the biggest energy producer. We're bigger than the Soviet Union. We're bigger than Saudi Arabia. We are the biggest oil and gas producer. Have you seen the clip? Donald Trump yelling about how much oil and gas the United States is producing. And it's supposed to be this amazing accomplishment, right? And it's true, because of hydraulic fracking, shale, right? We are now extracting more natural gas and more oil from the ground than ever before. The United States is the biggest energy producer in the world. However, here's what they're not telling you. And this is from a few days ago. And this really points to why we're having a little bit of a problem here. U.S. shale producers struggle on Wall Street. A broad index of U.S. oil and gas company shares fell last week to the lowest point since it was created during the early days of the shale boom in 2006, after drillers such as Conco Resources and Oasis Petroleum said while discussing the second quarter earnings that they were still struggling to meet production expectations and stay on budget. Many of the companies have yet to show that they can deliver consistent returns or live within their means, as investors have ratcheted up pressure to do so. But here is what you need to know. This is a quote from Paul Tice, a senior credit analyst. He writes, "Energy investors are at the point where they have zero tolerance for negative surprises in terms of operations or cash flow." That's true for both shareholders as well as bondholders. Here's what they're not telling you. Yes, the USA is producing more oil and more gas than ever before in its history, than any other nation in the world. But that's not good for our economy because they're doing it with borrowed money. They're doing it on credit. So imagine this. Imagine that you were unemployed, you didn't have a job, right? And you were out of money and you went to your friend and you said, "Can I borrow $200? And your friend says, "Okay, I'll give you $200. So you got $200 from your friend. And then it's been a couple months and your friend's like, "Can you pay me back that $200 already?" So you go and you help another friend move, and he gives you $100. And with that $100, you then give it to the friend with whom you borrowed $200 from. Would you then at that point go, "Yeah, look, my life's moving ahead. I just made $100. You didn't make $100 because you borrowed $200. That's what's going on with the oil and gas boom right now. All of this oil and gas production that's being carried out is being done on credit. The shale producers are deep in debt. Deep in debt. They're doing it all on loan from Wall Street banks. And if the oil price goes down, I mean, we're screwed. I mean, the U.S. economy is screwed. When the oil price dropped under Barack Obama, right? 2014, the oil price started really declining. It actually got as low as $27 a barrel. There was a time where you could go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, get a family meal for more than a barrel of oil cost. That's how low the oil price had gotten. A barrel of oil was less than $27 a barrel. And when that happened, that almost crashed our economy, right? Whole towns in Nebraska turned into ghost towns. And North Dakota turned into ghost towns. Texas property values went drastically low, right? Venezuela started having a big political and economic crisis, right? Countries like Iran also had big problems, right? When the oil prices dropped under Obama in 2014, when they started doing their nosedive, it dramatically hurt our economy. Well, right now, the shale companies, all of which are drilling like crazy on credit, are not paying back their loans right now. With the oil price hovering around $50 a barrel, safe zone, they're still not paying back what they owe. So if the oil prices were to drop, right? If this were to happen again, if we would start to go down to $40 a barrel, $30 a barrel, it would wreck things, right? The oil price is already in this weird spot of $50 a barrel. If the oil price were to drop, these shale guys ain't paying back their loans. They're not getting no credit. They're all going out of business. Banks are not getting paid back, and we're in a mess. We're in a wreck. And if you understand that, look at what is going on in the global markets right now. Escalation against Iran. Everything possible to get Iranian oil off the market. Why? Because if you take somebody off the market, a major oil-producing company, you can keep the price up, right? Huge pressure against Venezuela. USA not even buying any Venezuelan oil anymore, right? Huge effort to get Venezuela out of the oil markets. Why? Because if you take Venezuela, a country with huge oil reserves, maybe even as big as Saudi Arabia, and you push them off the market, you can keep the price up high. They're sitting there, I'm telling you folks, they're sitting there and they're going, oh my God, we gotta keep the price up, gotta keep the price up. And they're going crazy here. They're going, what can we do to keep the price up? Can we keep the price up? Because if that oil price drops, if the oil price drops, folks, if it does what it did in 2014 again, we're in a big, big mess. We're in a big, big mess. And that's what's going on. Wall Street is sitting there going, oh my God, these shale guys, they're not making any money. They're not paying back their loans. They're drilling. Oh yeah, they're drilling. It's the biggest since the fall of the Soviet. Oh wow, it's the greatest, biggest. But they're not making any money. The shale guys are having a shale boom. They're drilling, they're exporting, and they're not making any money, and they're not paying back their loans. And if the oil price went down, we're screwed. We're screwed. That's what's going on, and they're not making a big deal out of it. You can read it in the fine print of the Wall Street Journal if you're a nerd like me, a guy who goes through it. That's what's going on here, folks. They're doing everything they can. They're desperately, desperately trying to keep the oil price from dropping, because if it drops, shale in the USA collapses. It almost collapsed in 2014. The fracking cowboy guy committed suicide, drove his car into a wall. I mean, it was big in 2014. But if it happens this time, they're going to take a big chunk of Wall Street down with them, and it's going to be a big, big mess. See, these people, they don't understand, and this is what is left out, right, is that growth based on debt is not growth. It's not. Economic growth is when the standard of living goes up, when the spending power of people increases, when their ability to buy products increases, when the amount of products being produced goes up, when the amount of products being purchased goes up, when all boats are going up, when everyone is rising, that's called economic growth. When the standard of living is increasing, when the spending power is increasing, when production is increasing, when profits are, when everything is rising, that's real economic growth. That's not what we have right now in the United States. We have debt-based economic growth, right? Right now, at this point, 42% of Americans, bet you didn't know this, 42% of Americans make $15 an hour or less. 42%. That's like almost half the country. 8% less than half of the country is making less than $15 an hour at this point. Furthermore, the percentage of Americans that cannot afford a $400 emergency is very, very high. Very, very high. The spending power of Americans is not going up. The wages of Americans are barely going up, and they're already pretty darn low generationally compared. Most Americans that are adults, that are, in their 30s and their 20s, are still basically economically dependent on their parents, even if they're employed, even if they're living on their own. They still need some kind of financial support, right? Oh, here's a gem. Mortgage debt hits record eclipsing 2008 peak. Do you remember 2008? The mortgage debt, the housing bubble? There is more mortgage debt now than there was when the housing bubble burst. This is not good news, folks. This is not good news at all. Right? This is a vulnerable economy. Trump says that it's the middle of an economic miracle, that it's an economic miracle. It's never been better. It's so amazing. No, it is not. We are sitting on a house of cards, and pretty soon it could all come crashing down. All come crashing down. We are not in a good situation economically right now. And part of it is related to the fact that Trump seems to have a Rasputin of his own, right? He's got a magical wizard whispering in his ear. He's got Merlin, or I guess Merlin was a good guy, but he's got Rasputin whispering in his ear. What's he whispering? Well, if you just attack China more, it'll solve everything. If we just attack China and we attack China, that's going to solve everything. And who's the Rasputin who is whispering in the ear of Donald Trump? It is the discredited economic flim-flam man named Peter Navarro. Peter Navarro. This is the man from the White House Trade Council who is setting U.S. economic policy right now. Peter Navarro. And Peter Navarro is a flim-flam man. Peter Navarro is an anti-China hack, right? He's a professor. He's from California, and for years he's been writing books and giving lectures and making little documentaries about how all of our economic problems are all caused by China. Oh, that darn China. If China weren't there, everything would be fine. China. I mean, this guy, I bet you this guy would tell you that China was responsible for the Crusades. This guy would tell you that China was responsible for a meteorite hitting the earth and killing the dinosaurs. That's Peter Navarro. He's a flim-flam man. He's a flim-flam man. He's a what? He's a flim-flam man. And he is telling Donald Trump all kinds of things about the economy that all the other economists are not agreeing with. All of these guys who did go to Harvard and did go to Yale and all of that, and all of these guys, they know that what Peter Navarro is telling Donald Trump is just not reality. But Trump wants to hear it, and certain economic interests that don't like China really want to hear it, and because they want to hear it, we're doubling down. Peter Navarro is setting U.S. economic policy, and it's very, very, very scary. It's very, very scary, folks. This Peter Navarro guy has gone out of his way to convince everybody, and that China is the cause of all of America's economic woes, all the problems, all the drop in wages, all the declining living standards. All of this is all China's fault. If China wasn't there, none of this would happen. And because of that, we're taking moves that are not helping the economy. This is a very, very vulnerable situation. Now, a couple theories exist. Some want to give the Trump White House a little more credit than maybe due. Some argue that, number one, Trump is figuring there's going to be an economic crash anyway, right? That the Trump White House, they figured out, okay, the economy's going to crash. Let's start a big fight with China so we can say that China did it. That's one theory, right? That when the crash comes, Trump will turn around and say, see, look what those rotten Chinese did. And it'll just be all blamed on China. That's one theory. Theory number two is that Donald Trump is holding off resolving the trade disputes until the economy crashes. The economy will crash, and then he'll finally give in and settle with China and say, look, I saved the day. I finally got us a deal. That's one theory. So, who knows what's going to happen here? But things are not looking good. Not looking good at all on Wall Street right now. They're looking very, very, very bad. And the fact that these shale guys are not paying back what they owe, and the oil price is looking like it's going to drop anytime soon, and they're scrambling and they're doing everything they can, it seems like, to keep the oil price high. And it ain't staying up because there's just so darn much of it in the world economy right now. There's just so much oil and so much gas, right? The amount has expanded, so demand is decreasing as supply goes up, right? Meanwhile, right? At the same time, Americans don't have the spending power they once had. Student debt through the roof, household debt through the roof, mortgage debt. Yes, we have an economy centered around people owing other people. We have a credit-based economic system at this point where bankers and lenders sit at the center of the global economy. This is a mess. This is a very, very big mess. And part of the reason that it's a mess is because they've gone out of their way to convince you that you can't understand it. You can't understand it. This is just too complicated for you to understand, so you're not going to take action around it. And you're not going to vote on it, and you're not really going to do anything about it because you think you can't understand this. It's just too complicated. I can't understand it. I can't understand it. This is high, complicated stuff. It's not really that complicated, right? That we have a system called capitalism. And in the system of capitalism, the banks, factories, and major centers of economic power are controlled by capitalists, people who own them. And they don't own them because they feel like it. They own them in order to make profits from them. They own the means of production, the commanding heights of economic power, and they utilize them to make profits. And as a result of that, all kinds of crazy things go on, where you've got a prison for profit system. Why? Well, they make more profits from locking people in jail. They've got schools for profit, charter schools, right? Make more profits from sending kids to school. We've got a military-industrial complex, right? Why not? Make profits from war. You know, bombs and tanks and drones are a great way to make money. Furthermore, the capitalist is always looking to pay the worker as little as possible. Why? Why pay the worker as little as possible? Because the less he pays, the more profits he gets. Furthermore, he's looking to hire as few workers as he possibly can. Why? The less workers he hires, the more profits he gets. Furthermore, he's looking to eliminate jobs with technology and make production more and more efficient so he can pay fewer and fewer people. Why? Fewer people he hires, the more efficient production becomes, the more money he makes. And then there's a mess, because at the end of the day, these people that he doesn't want to pay, these people he doesn't want to employ, they all are the consumers who have to buy the products that get produced. And it's a big mess, and it's a big contradictory system where A never equals B and never equals C. Or as I've explained to you before, the worker can never buy back the product that he produces. And it's a mess, right? And the more technology advances, and the more they use the Federal Reserve to try and stabilize it, and the more they create all kinds of artificial mechanisms to keep growth going, the more they pile things on to try and make a naturally unstable and irrational system rational. The more they do that, the more dramatic and big the crash is when it finally comes. When it finally comes. Back in the 1920s, they said that we had entered an era of endless prosperity. Economic growth was permanent, right? Because, capitalism, Henry Ford had overtaken Karl Marx, right? Assembly line production, Federal Reserve banking, J.P. Morgan, they'd all figured it all out, and capitalism would never crash, and then the Great Depression happened. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Same kind of stuff. I remember it. I was a kid. I wasn't even paying attention to economic literature back then, but I even heard it. Economic growth will happen definitely going to happen. Economic growth is endless. Communism failed. The American system is amazing. It's expanding all over the world. There's no end to this economic growth. It's just going to keep growing and expanding no matter what. And then things started to have a downturn before 9/11, and then they had a really big downturn, really, really dramatic downturn under Obama, or right before Obama took office, the 2008 crash. I'm telling you folks, our economy is vulnerable. Our economy is very, very vulnerable right now. Very, very vulnerable. And we have a big problem. We have an economy centered around debt. So welcome, those of you who are just joining us. I know we've been expanding as I've been talking for the last 28 minutes. We're having a great time here. Those of you who are just joining us now, be sure to push that subscribe button. I see you, Ramiro Funes. I see you, Will DeMarco. I see you, Issa. I see you, Sheepless in Seattle. I see you, Prometheus. I love you all. I'm glad you're here. If you have not pushed the subscribe button, now is the time to push the subscribe button. And if you have not pushed the notifications button, now is the time to push the notifications button, because we are having a great time here. We've got so much to talk about. Shout out to Faint Signals from Vega. So much to talk about. We're having a great time here, folks. We're friends. We're a community here. We're doing something rather unique and rather exciting. What a lovely time. Welcome to Sunday afternoon with Caleb Maupin. Shout out to you, Rick Fry. Oh boy, I get fired up sometimes, folks. I know you love me for it. Sometimes maybe you don't love me for it. I try to be happy. I try to be upbeat. There you go. What else is new in the world, folks? What do you want to talk about? I'm drinking some of that forbidden beverage, but I've got plenty of water too. Yes. I saw people sending out that Bill Maher made a nasty rant against boycott, divestment, and sanctions last night on his show, basically accusing those who boycott Israel of being, just awful and all of that, and that some people are calling for a boycott of Bill Maher's TV program. There you go. I mean, I've never really cared for Bill Maher, honestly. I find him to be a bit of a snob. There's kind of this snobbery that just reeks out of his program. There's an element of just everything people don't like about liberals and elites, and there you go. Shout out to Katie Lux. Shout out to Green Element. We're having a great time here. We're having a great time. But what else is new, folks? What else is new? I wanted to mention, after my little economic rant there, I wanted to mention that, the schools of economics, and I talk to people who have been highly educated. There's a well-known Marxist economist who I have the privilege, because of where I work, of seeing pretty frequently. Really brilliant fellow, and he and I have a lot of chats about economics. And I remember he was telling me about how basically economics has turned into a field where people get paid to say what people want to hear, and that's a big disaster. And that a lot of what passes for economics nowadays is simply people being paid by foundations and think tanks to produce the data that they want to hear. And it's really, really tragic. Really, really, really tragic. It's weird. So, libertarianism is a field where all these people who study, they take Economics 101, they read, Ludwig von Mises, they read Bastiat, they read Friedrich von Hayek, they read Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, and they walk around as if they know everything that there is to know about economics. And they don't. They know the standard line. They know neoliberalism. They don't like neoliberalism because they don't understand that that's an economic term. They think that means they're liberals. They don't like liberals, so they're libertarians. But they're neoliberal economics. They're advocates of Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, Alan Greenspan economic malarkey. And they walk around as if they know it all, right? They're talking about, I guess you've never heard of supply and demand. Somebody made the analogy that telling a Marxist, that a libertarian telling a Marxist that they are ignorant about economics is the equivalent of someone going around and saying, there's these things called imaginary numbers, there's this thing called calculus, there's this thing called advanced calculus, there's this thing called negative numbers, there's integers. They're explaining rather high level mathematics, and a first grader says, no, 2 + 2 = 4. If you wouldn't, and it's like that level, right? These people, they know supply and demand. They know basic Adam Smith concepts, and they walk around as if there's never been any problem with any of this, right? There's never been any market failures. There used to be an entire school of economics called market failures, where they would simply study what happens when the market fails, because it does. It fails all the time. But now market failures don't exist. Government failures. Market failures don't exist. It's never occurred to them. It's rather tragic. But the other thing is, these libertarians, they love to run the line. They always say, well, Hitler was a socialist, right? Because it's the National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? You've heard that before, right? Oh, Hitler was a socialist. He believed in big government. Oh, the German government spent money on stuff, so Hitler must have been a Marxist or a communist. They run this line. But what's interesting is during the aftermath of the Second World War, even among conservatives, there was a knowledge that a lot of libertarian rhetoric had a fascistic overtone. The prominent voice of libertarianism in the United States during the 1950s was Ayn Rand. Do folks know who Ayn Rand is? You should know who Ayn Rand is, because it's kind of an interesting story. So she was a young woman in the Soviet Union. Her father was a chemist in the Soviet Union in Russia. During the Russian Civil War, it was a state of war. Millions of people were dying. They seized his property. They forced her to house people in her home. She hated it. She hated communism. She got a free education from the Soviet government in cinematography, engaged in some visa fraud, and was able to leave the Soviet Union for the United States after getting a free education in the Soviet Union. Moved to Chicago, eventually became a Hollywood screenwriter, or worked in a screenwriting office. During the McCarthy period, she narked on her co-workers who were communists and testified against them and became kind of a celebrity. And as a result, her novels, like The Fountainhead, which has a rape scene in it, in which she portrays rape as a heroic act. The Howard Rourke character breaks into a woman's home and violently rapes her. She portrays it as this heroic act, somehow a good thing. You got Atlas Shrugged, which is a novel about the rich people of the world going on strike against the ungrateful poor people who don't recognize their greatness. She wrote a collection of essays explaining her moral philosophy called The Virtue of Selfishness. She wrote there's a collection of her essays called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. She believed basically that altruism and compassion are the greatest evils that exist, and that greed and selfishness is the motor of the world, and that compassion rewards the weak. All her life, she had this weird admiration for murderers, and axe murderers and rapists. When she first came to the United States, for example, she was living in Chicago, and there was a man named William Hickman who strangled and killed his wife, and was told that if he would apologize for strangling and killing his wife, he would not get the death penalty. And he refused, saying that his wife, had cheated on him or whatever and deserved to be strangled, so he was given the death penalty. And Ayn Rand loved this guy and had pictures of him in her bedroom and just fawned over this man who was a wife strangler. People wonder about what motivated Ayn Rand to be so bizarre, why she admired cruelty so much, why she worshipped those with wealth and hated those in poverty. People wonder if she was abused by her father. People wonder if she saw her father's humiliation at the hands of the Bolsheviks and thought he was weak and didn't stand up to the communists enough. People try to psychoanalyze her herself. People wonder if maybe she was abused by her father. It was PTSD, where she's sympathizing with rapists and murderers because she was, molested or abused or something like that. We don't know why Ayn Rand thought the way she did. Maybe it was a chemical imbalance. Maybe she was a natural-born psychopath. We don't know why. We do know the first political cause Ayn Rand ever donated to was Israel and Zionism. She was a big, big supporter of Israel and Zionism. So much so that she advocated at one point the United States invading all the Arab countries during the OPEC boycott and seizing their oil. She said, they have no right to their oil if they do nothing with it. Unbelievable. She said that the genocide against Native Americans was a good thing when she was speaking at the Ford Hall Forum because, they do nothing with the land. We came here. It's that kind of mindset. Ayn Rand's a very sick person. Not a good person. Any society in history, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Confucian, whatever, they're going to look at somebody like Ayn Rand and say, this is a sick woman, right? And generally we think helping people is good. We think hurting people is wrong. That's just generally how people think. That's just kind of the basic essence of humanity. We don't admire cruelty. We don't scoff and think compassion is weakness and evil. Natural, normal human behavior is not the way Ayn Rand thought. However, Ayn Rand, because she loved capitalism and she hated the communists, because of that, Ayn Rand got this really, really special place in American political thought and thinking. So much so that Paul Ryan, top Republican in Congress, considers Ayn Rand to be his personal hero. And many people believe that Rand Paul, the son of Ron Paul, libertarian Ron Paul, is named after Ayn Rand. Now, that's not confirmed, and I think that would cause a problem for Ron Paul if that's confirmed, because Ron Paul is a Christian and a conservative, and Ayn Rand was an atheist, so much so that she thought religion was bad because it caused people to have compassion. I believe she referred to what she called the guilt-peddling Jesus industry. Religion is bad because it encourages people to feed the poor and care for other people. Can't have that. This is Ayn Rand, right? Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve from 1987 up until 2007, right? The most powerful, arguably one of the most powerful men in the USA that's not been elected, right? I mean, he's overseeing the Federal Reserve Bank and lending policies, big believer in deregulation. He was Ayn Rand's friend. They were very close. He was her protege, basically. When Alan Greenspan got his first government job, Ayn Rand went to the White House with him. That's how close they were. They used to go to jazz clubs up into the time when Ayn Rand died in the mid-'80s. They would go to jazz clubs together, right? So Alan Greenspan, the guy who's directing economic policy, is the protege of a woman who glorifies rape in her novels and thinks that genocide against the Native Americans was great and advocates invading all the Arab countries. And yeah, that's who was directing our economy, right? You could think this is just some obscure novelist, right? This is just some obscure novelist with a degree in cinematography and she's right-wing. No. Highly influential woman, Ayn Rand. So let me get back to the point I was making. I was making a point earlier about fascism. So Ayn Rand, right? And of course, Ayn Rand maintains, she's not a fascist. She is a capitalist and, fascism, National Socialism, it's collectivist, right? No. She believes in individualism, no collectivism. Well, folks, if you read, there's a review of Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged. And it was written in National Review magazine, very conservative magazine, by Whittaker Chambers, who was a very, very right-wing person in the 1950s, star witness of the House Un-American Activities Committee, right-wing, conservative, anti-communist voice. He read Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged. And he said, I kid you not, that in Atlas Shrugged, behind every line, there was a voice echoing the phrase, "To the gas chamber go." He could tell it was fascist. It gave him a fascist sense. And these libertarians look at that, Ayn Rand can't be a fascist. Oh, no. Ayn Rand can't be a fascist because fascism is big government and libertarians want no government. So libertarians can't have anything to do with fascism. Well, you're wrong. You're wrong. Folks, who were the first people that the Nazis exterminated or liquidated? Who was it? Who were the first people the Nazis exterminated? The disabled community. And what did they call the disabled community that they liquidated? What did they call them? Useless eaters. You can look that up. The phrase that they used to describe the disabled community, people that were, had trouble breathing, couldn't work, mentally disabled, physically disabled. As they were gassing those people, they said the reason they did it is because they were useless eaters. And that was the term that they used. They actually had a poster, I kid you not, of a disabled man, and it said, "This man costs the German people so much money per year." Right? This idea that certain people in the community of humans are worthless and deserve to be exterminated. One of the most interesting anecdotes I ever heard about Nazi Germany. And again, you never know about this kind of thing. So I'm just telling you, I've heard this anecdote. I've seen it in a lot of World War II era literature, but, you never know about this kind of thing. But and then one of the most interesting anecdotes I heard was that in Nazi Germany, when school children were being educated by the Nazi regime, that they would read them a children's story about a rabbit being eaten by a wolf. And they would read them this story about, the rabbit is very scared of being eaten. It's running, it's trying to flee. The wolf is chasing it here and chasing it there, till finally the wolf eats the rabbit. They would then put the book down and ask the children who they felt sorry for. And ask them, who do you feel sorry for in this story? And of course, the children, being human, not being robots, said, I feel sorry for the poor rabbit that's fleeing for its life, being eaten by a wolf. Poor thing, just wants to live, and that wolf is chasing after it. And the Nazi teacher, pushing the Nazi party line, would say, wrong. You should feel sorry for the wolf. Because the wolf is the natural superior of the rabbit. And the rabbit, by fleeing for its life, by making it hard for the wolf to capture his prey, is depriving the wolf of his natural place in the world. Right? The wolf is being oppressed by this rabbit that runs from him, makes it hard for him to get what he is entitled to, his prey. The rabbit is inferior, and the wolf is superior. There's a natural hierarchy in the world, and the strong must prey upon the weak. And when the weak resist, this must be suppressed. That was the Nazi Party line. That was the fascist outlook. And that is a libertarian viewpoint. That flows through every libertarian novel I've ever read. Compassion is weakness, right? We can't have we can't have social programs to aid the poor. People that are poor are just lazy. People that are rich are just brilliant. They're the motor of the world. They got there by working hard. I mean, any attempt to correct social injustice is just a communist plot to deprive great men. All the libertarian literature is just like that. It's the same mindset. Psychologically, it's the same. Politically, sure, it's different, right? Fascists were all for government intervention. They wanted the government to come in there and exterminate the disabled people. They wanted the government to come in there and build a huge military. They wanted the government to enforce this natural order. Libertarians tend to believe, well, if the government just stays out of everything, we can have a natural order. But it's still the same belief. That some people deserve to be oppressed, some people deserve to be poor, and those who are wealthy, well, they're just naturally superior and deserve to be that way. And then any attempt to correct social hierarchy, any attempt to correct injustice, any attempt to make the world a better place, any joint effort to raise people up and create and build living standards and make a better world, any attempt at that is playing God. It's the Tower of Babel. That is the fascist mindset. And the libertarian mindset and the fascist mindset is the same. That's what Whittaker Chambers, not a fan of Whittaker Chambers, but that's what he saw. When he said that underneath Ayn Rand's writings, he heard a voice saying, "To the gas chamber go." He understood the mindset, right? It is a certain way of thinking that defines the extreme right. They have no empathy, they have no compassion, and they hate those who do. And that is deeply, deeply problematic. There are problems on the extreme left too, and I've talked about that. There are big problems, and we can talk about that later. But that's what you need to understand, is that there is an odd, and Nazis, who were Nazis raving against constantly? Communists, right? Is the communists are coming, communists, it's the red menace, communism. And who do libertarians rave against all the day long? Communists. The communists are coming. Oh my God, it's communism. Oh my God, they're going to raise, the price on gasoline by 2 cents because of a tax. That's communism. The like obsessive fear of communism. Seeing communists everywhere. Everyone you don't like is a communist. That is fascist, and that's also libertarian. There is a lot more common ground, psychologically speaking, between fascists and libertarians than they would like to believe, right? I mean, that's just a fact, folks. We shouldn't deny that. There you go. But what else is new, folks? What else is new in your world? I know there are a lot of you joining us here. Glad you're here. Please tweet this out. Please share this. We have so much to talk about today. So much to discuss. Wow. Yeah, so much to talk about. Wow. What is new? KJ Mack wants me to talk about Kashmir. I think that's deeply unfortunate, and I'm worried about that situation. Oh, someone's asking me about the New Deal, and I'm actually planning to talk about that later today. So, great question. What else is on people's minds? Folks, I'm having a great time here. You're having a great time. We're a great little community here. We're doing great things. I'm going to drink some more of the forbidden beverage. What else is new? People want me to talk about Proudhon. Wow, you can read a book by Karl Marx called The Poverty of Philosophy. It's funny, Proudhon, who's considered the father of anarchism, one of the big anarchist and utopian thinkers of France, he wrote a book called The Philosophy of Poverty. And it was a book, he advocated kind of model communities. He was, kind of a utopian anarchist, and he was for liberating the peasantry from their oppression. And part of doing that was kind of his design for like building these kind of model communities. And he wrote his book to lay out his theories called The Philosophy of Poverty. And Karl Marx wrote his polemic replying to it called The Poverty of Philosophy. And it was kind of a pun, kind of a joke, but he was an important anarchist of those times. And it's interesting. The first international, the International Working Men's Association that Karl Marx created, it fell apart mainly due to Karl Marx fighting with the anarchists. Not Proudhon, it was primarily Mikhail Bakunin. The two of them, they fought Marx, and eventually the first international, the International Working Men's Association, collapsed, interestingly. The second international, which was started in Germany. It was mainly centered around Germany. Germany was the center of it. It was the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SDP, or the SPD, I believe in German. That was the central party of the Second International. And the Second International is technically still around. I mean, it was officially dissolved in the lead up to World War I, but, it's Socialist International. I believe DSA is no longer part of it, the Democratic Socialists of America, but it's like the British Labour Party and the French Socialist Party and the German Social Democratic Party and a lot of parties in the developing world. I know, like Mubarak, his government in Egypt was part of the Second International. Ben Ali's government in Tunisia was part of the Second International. And it's a big international current of, it's social democracy. Now, interesting question I'm getting here from Bargoslav. He's asking me about the theory of social fascism. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. I'll explain the theory of social fascism, and I'll tell you what I think of it. But you have to understand the context first. So, let's back up. So the Russian Revolution happened, 1917. After the Russian Revolution, there were a whole bunch of uprisings and revolts taking place all across the world. Hungary, Britain, France, all kinds of places. The only place, in Germany it was really big, but the only place that it really won, the revolutions that happened in 1917 at the end of World War I, the only place they stayed in power was in Russia, right? And so Russia formed the Communist International, right? They felt the Second International because it had supported World War I, because it had not supported the Russian Revolution, was not a real communist or socialist or Marxist international. So they formed the Third International, or the Communist International, Comintern. It was formed, and Lenin founded the Comintern. And the problem was, a lot of these socialist parties really hated the Soviet Union, really hated communists. And they were dividing the working class. They were mobilizing. At that point, there were a lot of socialists and communists out there. The Marxist movement was big. So in Britain, you had the Labour Party. In the USA, you had the Socialist Party. In France, other places. So the social democratic parties were just doing everything they could to get their rank-and-file workers to hate the Soviet Union and to hate the communist parties that were aligned with it. And so Lenin had the theory of what he called the United Front. It was the United Front. And Lenin said, okay, what we'll do is we will call for action with other, anti-capitalist parties around demands, right? We'll demand an 8-hour workday. We'll demand an increase in the minimum wage. We'll demand these things, and we'll get other parties to have joint actions with us around these demands. We'll build the United Front. That was the idea, to build the United Front. And that was the Bolshevik program. And, in the United States, they built the United Front around freeing class war prisoners. The communists were key in fighting, and they ultimately failed, but in fighting very hard to save the life of Sacco and Vanzetti, two anarchists who were executed. And they were key in setting up, the demand around it. They were key in fighting for the right of garment workers in New York City. In the 1920s, the economy was booming, but still, the communists in the United States worked very, very hard to try and build a united front where they would be for things that any progressive or socialist would be for, and they would try to get the Socialist Party and the Social Democrats to support it. They would try to get the anarchists and the IWW to support it. They'd try to get ordinary working class people who weren't in any party to support it. And they were going to have a united front around demands. And it would be, unity in action, but differences in ideology. That was the theory of the United Front, and that Lenin was arguing with the Bolsheviks and with the communists around the world in favor of doing that, because a lot of the communists around the world didn't want to build a united front. They felt like the Social Democrats were a bunch of sellouts, they hated them, they were phonies. But Lenin was constantly urging the communists around the world. They said the way to defeat, the way we're going to make, the way we're going to defeat capitalism eventually, the way we're going to expand among the working class movement is by building this thing called the United Front, right? And in Britain, that involved voting for the Labour Party, right? The Labour Party was anti-communist, but the capitalists, were trying to outlaw the Labour Party. They had this fake letter from Russia called the Zinoviev letter that tried to prove the Labour Party were a bunch of Russian agents. And so on that basis, Lenin said to the British workers, you got to support the Labour Party, but you'll be supporting the Labour Party like a noose supports a hanged man. Meaning, in order to destroy the Labour Party, you must support the Labour Party. The average working class person who's in the Labour Party sees the Labour Party being attacked, and so they're going to rally to support it. And if you're going to say, oh, the Labour Party is a bunch of phonies, well, then you're not going to have any influence over them. And Lenin is trying to urge the policy of the United Front. That was Lenin's theory. In China, the United Front generally involved supporting nationalism and supporting the anti-Western, anti-capitalism and the anti-imperialism of the KMT and Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and to the point that Dr. Sun Yat-sen met with Lenin many times and they got along very well. All over the world, the communists were trying to build united fronts. And the response of the Social Democrats in the United States was to ban communists from their unions. If you were in a union for the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, they would ban if you were a communist. You were not allowed to be in the union, which meant you couldn't get a job in a lot of cases. If it was a skilled trade or something, and you were a communist, and the union found out, you were kicked out. Like, they were doing everything they could, everything they could to try and just push communists out of the labor movement. They had slogans like "the main enemy is on the left." That was one of their slogans. Basically the Social Democrats were in an anti-communist frenzy. Get the communists out. The communists help capitalism by making socialism look bad. I'm sure you've heard that before, right? The people who defend the Soviet Union make socialism and Marxism look bad. It was just this effort to just try and isolate and attack the communists. That was going on. So Lenin died, and there was more debate. And then in 1928, Trotsky had been defeated on the one hand, and on top of that, Bukharin had been defeated. The Bukharinites, the right opposition, had been defeated. And the leaders of the Communist International, Stalin, others, they could see that the global economic crisis was approaching. The global economic crisis was approaching. The 1929 stock market crash, the communists kind of saw it coming. So they had the 6th Congress of the Communist International, 1928, and they completely changed their tactics. And they announced at the 6th Congress that they were entering what they called the third period. The third period. The first period had been the Russian Revolution and all the uprisings afterwards. The second period had been the period of capitalist stabilization, where communists were trying to form united fronts. But now, with a global economic crisis approaching, and with the Soviet Union having the 5-year plans and beginning to rapidly industrialize, they were entering what they called the third period. The third period. And at the 6th Congress, they announced the beginning of the third period. And they said that the new slogan of the Communist International was class against class. Class against class. And they then began to refer to the Social Democrats as social fascists. Right? Because they said that because Social Democrats in Germany were killing communists in big numbers, because Social Democrats in Britain, had kicked communists out of the labor unions, because Social Democrats in the United States were conspiring, to push communists out of the labor movement, that they began referring to Social Democrats as social fascists. Right? And then that was from 1928 until 1935, when the Comintern was in what they called the third period, that was their position. Now, somebody made reference to it in the comment section. I mean, hey, I always like to do things a little more culturally, but there was actually a song. I knew an old communist. She'd been in the Young Pioneers Club when she was a little kid. She wore a little red beret. Lived in New York City. And New York City, the Garment Workers Union, there was a constant struggle, right? The David Dubinsky was the leader of the Garment Workers Union. He was in the Socialist Party. He hated the Communist Party. He was always trying to get the Communist Party kicked out of the unions. He also hated black people. He was constantly trying to keep black people out of the garment factories and marginalize African Americans and keep them out of the garment factories. What they call Chelsea in New York City now. Used to be the Garment District, Midtown Manhattan. It used to be very working class and poor, and a lot of working class people from Eastern Europe, would work, making clothes all day long in these kind of sweatshops. And it was David Dubinsky, who was from the Socialist Party, who was like the union boss. And he was a social democrat. He was in the Socialist Party. He hated communists. And the communists, in 1926, they organized a big citywide strike, and then the Socialist Party sold it out, and there was a whole struggle between the social democratic leaders of the Garment Workers Union and, on the other hand, and the communists in New York City. And there was actually, so when the line changed, when they were no longer trying to have unity with the Social Democrats, when they declared that the Social Democrats were social fascists, they actually, I kid you not, had a little bit of a nursery rhyme that they wrote about one of the big Socialist Party unions, which was called the Cloakmakers Union, which I will now, as requested in the chat, sing for you. It was taught to this old woman I knew back when I was a member of a political organization, and she had learned this when she was a child in the 1930s. And it went like this. The Cloakmakers Union is a no-good union. It's a company union by the bosses. Those right-wing cloakmakers are just socialist fakers who play upon the workers' double crosses. The Hillquits, Dubinskys, and the Thomases are making the workers false promises. They preach socialism while they practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. Yeah. It's actually from Mozart, interestingly enough. It's a Mozart melody that's used in some of Mozart's piano pieces. And the Bolsheviks actually had a version of it called The Capitalists Oppress Us. It's kind of hilarious. But yeah, it's just a dun 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 dun. Right. The right-wing cloakmakers are just socialist fakers who play upon the workers' double crosses. The Hillquits, Dubinskys, and the Thomases are making the workers false promises. They preach socialism while they practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. Right, well, Hillquit is Morris Hillquit, leader of the Socialist Party. Dubinsky is Dave Dubinsky, the boss of the Garment Workers Union in New York City. And Thomas is Norman Thomas. The Hillquits, Dubinskys, and Thomases are making the workers false promises. They preach socialism while they practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. And the line was, okay, sure, Mussolini, fascist in Italy, lines up workers against the wall and shoots them, but so do the socialists. So they're not really socialists, they're social fascists. That was their position. And during that time, one of the main activities of the Communist Party was trying to expose the Socialist Party as being phony and fake. And that was the third period. And one thing I will say about the third period, right, that a lot of the sectarianism, people try to blame the third period for Hitler coming to power. They say if the communists and the Social Democrats had been able to unite, then they could have blocked Hitler. Well, that's true, except they weren't going to be able to unite. I mean, these are groups that were killing each other. When there was the Red May of 1929, there was a May Day strike in New York, in Berlin, very famously in Berlin in 1929. And it was shut down. A lot of people died, but the cops who shot down communists in Berlin were all wearing Socialist Party buttons. It was socialist cops killing communist workers. Like, they weren't going to unite. It's not like a matter of if Stalin had just signed the right proclamation, Hitler would never have come to power. No. The Social Democrats had killed Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. The idea that the Communist Party of Germany and the Socialist Party of Germany were going to unite to stop Hitler, it wasn't going to happen. It just wasn't going to happen. And people, the Trotskyites want to blame Stalin for, no, they're missing the point. Like, these groups were blood enemies, right? The Socialist Party of Germany was factory workers who still had jobs. The Communist Party was unemployed people who were desperately poor and starving and wanted a revolution. And the third period that they used to talk about in the Communist International, it happened here in the United States, it happened all over the world, but in Berlin, the third period, they used to have what they called bread riots, very famously. The bread riots. And what would happen was the communists would lead a parade of unemployed people at night into areas where there were stores, and they would break the windows and start taking the food and distributing it. And then when the police showed up to stop them, they would have people on the roof with sniper rifles, and they would start shooting down the police. Right? That was big. That was a level of militancy that was very extreme. Right? They had an armed wing, the communists in Germany, called the Red Front Fighters League. And it was this very, very militant, period. In the United States, the third period was the period of unemployed organizing. They had, thousands of people would march in New York City, march to Washington, D.C., in what they called the hunger marches. And they would demand work or wages now. And they would break into the buildings of elected officials and demand work or wages now. And they'd get crowds of hungry children. Who would go out and organize. And these people were desperately poor. And it was a lot of immigrant folks from Eastern Europe, and it was a lot of Irish folks, and it was a lot of Italians, and it was a lot of African-American folks, and they were desperately poor because of the capitalist crisis. And they were starving. People were dying of hunger at that point. And so the communists, they organized these people into the unemployed councils, and they would lead them to break into stores and take food, to barge into the offices of elected officials and attack them, they were fighting for people's basic right to eat. That was, the slogan that the Communist Party USA had during that period was fight or starve. Or another version of it was don't starve, fight. Don't starve, fight. And it was a period of extreme militancy. And they did some amazing, amazing things during that period. 1932, when there were all these people that were hungry, Great Depression, Henry Ford had laid off lots of auto workers. And so the Communist Party, had led all these auto workers to Henry Ford's mansion to protest. And then Henry Ford's security guards came out and mowed them all down with machine guns. The Ford Massacre of 1932, just a horrendous, horrendous event. The communists, they were involved in fighting for average people's basic needs. In Alabama, the leader of the communists was an African-American man named Angelo Herndon, and he led 5,000 people in Alabama to go to the state capitol and demand that they start giving people food and start feeding the unemployed. And so they did. And the government officials panicked as they saw this mob of thousands of hungry people, and so they agreed. And then they charged Angelo Herndon. They charged him with a law that had been existed on the books since slavery, a law that forbid urging black people to revolt, made it a capital offense. They tried to give him the death penalty for leading this demonstration. Now, ultimately, the Supreme Court stepped in and freed him. But that was pretty big. And that was, the communists, during their third period, they did a lot of amazing, heroic things. They were a very, very militant party. However, weaknesses, they were very hostile, not just to the Socialist Party, but to all other left organizations, right? No matter who you were. If you were, the Trotskyites, you were a fascist, right? If you were the anarchists or the narco-syndicalists, the IWW, you were a fascist. All other parties except for the Communist Party were fascist. They were the one true party. It was the height of one true party theory. The Soviet Union was having an economic boom because of socialism. They were the party linked to the Soviet Union. Therefore, they were the one true party, and that settles that. There were some problems, but William Z. Foster really came to power during the third period because while Jay Lovestone, who had been his rival, didn't accept the theory of the third period and ended up getting kicked out of the Communist Party for American exceptionalism. William Z. Foster ascended to the leadership of the Communist Party, and William Z. Foster accepted the third period. And you should read about March 6th, 1931 was Unemployment Day in New York City. Really militant demonstrations, that rocked the city. When the police on horseback tried to charge, they knocked them over with marbles. They rolled a bunch of marbles and knocked them over. And it was they called it a red riot in the New York Times. It was a huge occurrence. The Communist Party at that point, they really started to have a lot of strength. And a lot of their strength came from the fact there were actually a lot of like skilled and professional people who joined them because at the time, U.S. economy was in collapse. There wasn't a lot of construction going on. So a lot of electrical engineers went to the Soviet Union, got hired to work on their electrification projects. They were electrifying the entire Soviet Union at that point. They had the biggest hydroelectric power plant in the world, the Dnieper Dam, at that point. So at that time, a lot of electrical engineers, a lot of construction, architects, all kinds of people were going to the Soviet Union, technicians, and they were in awe of the growth. And a lot of the people who joined the Communist Party during this time were actually, skilled professionals who were just kind of impressed with what they saw in the Soviet Union. And then the logical conclusion was they were seeing this economic miracle happening in the Soviet Union. And based on that, they joined the U.S. Communist Party. I know Norman Bethune, the very famous Canadian, he joined the Communist Party during this time because he was walking to work one day and he saw an unemployed demonstration. And then he saw the police beating up the unemployed, and some unemployed people were injured. And so being a doctor, he ran and tried to give medical assistance to some of these unemployed protesters. And because he saw that, because he did that, he was then arrested. And then that is what started Norman Bethune, the wealthy doctor, on the road to becoming like the martyr, the great martyr of the Chinese Revolution, Dr. Norman Bethune. In the small town that I grew up in, I did a Google search to find out if there'd ever been another communist from Orville, Ohio, the small town I grew up in. And there was a communist by the name of Carl Geiser. And Carl Geiser had been an electrical engineer. He had studied at Cleveland State University, and he'd gone to the Soviet Union and seen how amazing their economic progress was. And then he came back and joined the Communist Party USA. And he eventually fought in Spain in the Spanish Civil War. The Communist Party at that point, that was the height of their strength, but it was also a period where they were very isolated, and they had a lot of enemies, and they were their rhetoric during that time period was very, very bloodthirsty. I think it was a little bit ultra-left, I'll be honest. And now we look back on the Communist Party and we say, how in the world could they have thought the Socialist Party were fascist? Sure, the Socialist Party may not have been very radical, but they weren't like Hitler. But there was no Hitler yet. Hitler didn't come to power until 1933. So people didn't know that the Holocaust hadn't happened yet. People didn't know what these words meant, right? And so it was an agitational way of explaining that the Socialist Party were the enemy. They weren't the real communists. It wasn't strategic, not a term I would use now, but it made sense in the context. Yeah, it made sense at the time when the socialists are killing communists. And when the socialists claim they believe the same thing the communists believe, but they're killing communists en masse, you say, oh, they're not really socialists, they're social fascists. It was agitation. It was a way of making the point. I mean, that's really what it was. They were making a point. And then, in 1935, they reversed themselves. And that's what everyone, the Trotskyites are like, your line's going to change again, right? Oh, you zigzag. Well, in 1935, Hitler had come to power. Spain was on the brink of, I think the Spanish Civil War had already started, and there was this rise of fascism. So at that point, the communists in 1935, at the 7th Congress of the Communist International, they reversed themselves to build the United Front against fascism, or the People's Front, the Popular Front against fascism. And at that point, they were for unity with anybody who was against fascism. So people say, they zigzagged. Well, yeah, the world changed. Conditions changed. In the early 30s, their main enemy was the Socialist Party. In the late 30s, their main enemy was the fascists. And the world doesn't stay in one place. It doesn't change, right? And so that's a Trotskyist thing to do. It's like, has your position changed? It's 3 o'clock, they zigzag. They're going one way, they're running to the left, then they're running to the right. They're kind of missing the point. They're missing the point entirely, which is the world is constantly changing. And the conditions are constantly changing. And that, what socialist countries believe and what socialist countries advocate tactically, what socialist parties and organizations advocate tactically, changes based on material circumstances. For example, in the 1970s, 1980s, Cuba and the communist parties of Latin America believed in guerrilla warfare, right? They had the Tricontinental Congress, and they believed in guerrilla warfare. It was the FARC, and it was the Sandinistas, and it was every Latin American country. There was an armed communist guerrilla group, and there were, but why was that? It was because there were brutal military dictatorships in all those countries, right? wherever you went. Chile, Argentina, all these places, you had brutal military dictatorships. People couldn't organize peacefully above ground, and they couldn't organize in the cities. If you organized in the cities, the police would find you and kill you. So the line that Cuba, the line that Latin American communist parties took was, okay, now we're going to go into the countryside and we're going to organize guerrilla warfare. That was their position, right? And that was what they could do. They could go into the countryside and they could organize guerrilla warfare. And so that's what they did, right? And the Sandinistas took power after waging guerrilla warfare. And in El Salvador, I believe they took power through waging guerrilla warfare. And in Colombia, the FARC really got going, and in other places, because these countries were brutal autocratic dictatorships, and because organizing in the cities was nearly impossible. If you organized in the cities, you had to do it completely underground. I mean, the Pinochet regime used to find communists and not only kill them, but dump their bodies on the street. And you'd see dead bodies on the street with like a sign, "This guy's a communist." Really nasty stuff. And so you had to organize in the countryside, and you had to do it in an armed way because you were fighting for your self-defense. So that was a different time. Now you'll notice that Cuba and the communist parties of Latin America have a completely different orientation. Now they lead to the establishment of popular front governments, like in Venezuela, like in Bolivia, like in Nicaragua. They have electoral coalitions and build kind of anti-imperialist united fronts that run in elections and win, right? And they have kind of an alliance with the domestic capitalists against Western imperialism. And that's been successful, and it has led to the creation of socialism in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Nicaragua, but it's, again, the conditions changed. When there were brutal military dictatorships, you did one thing. When there were free elections in countries, when there was an opening of political space, you did something else. And during the 1990s, you saw a very strong shift in the tactics used by communist parties in Latin America. And it's not that one didn't work, right? It worked in the 80s. The Sandinista revolution was successful. There were other revolutions in the 80s, armed guerrilla revolutions, that worked. But then conditions changed, and it worked again, right? They were changing in order to win, right? They didn't do what all the communists in the United States do, which is they think there's this one right thing to do, and they just keep doing it over and over and over again. It's that old thing about the definition of insanity is when you expect that by doing the same thing over and over again, you're going to get different results. That's what generally communist groups in the United States do, and that's what Trotskyism as an ideology is based on. Trotskyists, they believe there's this magical right way to do things, right? That if you adopt the tactics that Lenin adopted in July of 1917 in Russia, that'll work in every circumstance. And the criticism that they have of the Communist International of Stalin, oh, look, they didn't do what Lenin did there. Oh, look, they didn't do what Lenin did there. And the world doesn't stay the same. The world is constantly in motion. And that's what these folks are missing. And that, you have to adjust tactics in order to win, right? I don't. I am strongly opposed to ultra-left adventurism, right? Because it's not Marxist, right? But, let's say that the United States became a brutal military dictatorship tomorrow, right? That the military took over the government. Let's say they started rounding up all the members of socialist parties and killing them in the United States. Let's say that in addition to that, they turned the internet off. Let's say that in addition to that, you can imagine circumstances in the United States very different than they are now that would require very, very different tactics. But that's not the circumstances. Right now in the United States, we have a right-wing conservative government that's trying to kind of be Bonapartist, but we can peacefully organize, right? We can pass out leaflets, we can state our views. So why would anyone in the United States at this time advocate ultra-left adventurous terrorism and violence? It wouldn't be necessary, and it would be problematic. It would make everything worse. Right? And that's the whole thing, right? When people are fighting for their life and defending themselves, that's one thing. When people are engaged in ultra-left adventurous extremism because they want to make themselves feel good, that's a very different thing. Violence is an awful thing. It's really awful, right? The only time that the working class in its broad masses would favor violence is when it's self-defense, when they have no choice, when it's kill or be killed, right? That's what people don't understand, right? That the folks who love violence, the folks who think violence is really exciting, and that's a middle-class deviation from Marxism. Working class people have violence in their everyday life. They see violence in their neighborhood. They see violence, they get drafted to fight in the wars, or they join the military and end up fighting in these wars, for goodness sakes, right? I mean, violence is an ugly reality for a lot of working class people, and it's not something they want more of. They want an end to chaos. And that's the gap between a lot of the middle-class intellectuals that make up the far left in the United States and the Western world and the broad masses of people. The masses of people want peace, they want stability, and they look to socialism as a way to bring peace and stability. And the revolutionary intelligentsia wants destruction and wants chaos to fulfill some kind of psychological desire, cathartic, I don't know what it's about, but that's not what the broad masses of people want. So there we go. We've rambled about all kinds of things. Social fascism, the Communist International, tactics, all kinds of stuff. Wow, what a day. How are folks doing? How are folks doing there? I've been reading your comments as they've been coming in. Wow. What's new? Well, Prometheus says, Caleb, can you discuss your intellectual and ideological journey? Well, I can, but I'm not going to, Prometheus, because there's a book on that coming up, right? You all know about city builders and vandals in our age. I hope you've ordered your copy of it. Great book. And it's going to take me a long time, but book number 2 is coming. Book number 2 is coming. The mysterious book number 2 is on its way. I don't want to say too much more about it, but you asked me about my intellectual journey. Book number 2 is in the works. Book number 2. Think about book number 2. You don't know much about it, but think about it. What else is going on, folks? What else is new? Oh, what else is new? The fear porn has gotten to be a YouTube joke. I don't know what that means. The fear porn has gotten to be a YouTube joke. Does anyone have suggestions on how to proceed with the coming American fascism? I don't think we're in a period of coming American fascism. I think things are becoming slightly more authoritarian. I think Trump is a demagogue. I think Trump appeals to right-wing sentiments. I think there are probably fascists who like Trump, but we're not. No, Trump is not a fascist. We're not heading toward fascism. Yeah, I don't think that's the case. That's my opinion. Oh, Prometheus asked about the New Deal. So I actually wanted to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the New Deal. Because I've noticed that there are 2 mistakes that I see regarding Roosevelt when people analyze Roosevelt. The biggest mistake I see is among people that are in Democratic Socialists of America or people that are Bernie Sanders supporters. And they'll say things like Roosevelt was a Democratic Socialist, Roosevelt was a socialist, you know, Roosevelt was just a really good guy, he did nothing wrong, you know, and they make it all about Roosevelt's personality. Roosevelt was such a great guy, kind of missing the point. The other deviation I see is people who say, oh, Caleb thinks Roosevelt's a socialist. Caleb says Roosevelt's a communist. Well, Roosevelt did a lot of bad stuff and did bad things. And therefore, that proves that Caleb is not a good communist because he says that Roosevelt... I'm just kidding. I don't know where that voice came from. But no, let's talk about Roosevelt. Let's talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a Bonapartist. And he was a Bonapartist president of the United States. And he progressed. He got more and more progressive as his life went on. And I think if he had lived, he probably would have at least attempted to become something like an American Hugo Chavez, but he didn't live. But throughout most of his life, he was a Bonapartist. He was a lot like maybe Juan Perón. You know, he was a progressive figure who did a lot of very good things. But he did those things for reasons that you will understand if you listen to what I'm saying here. As a Marxist, you can't be a dictionary, right? That's what I see many people that are very new to this kind of thinking do, right? I say, I like Roosevelt, and they're like, but Roosevelt is not a communist. I have a dictionary, and the dictionary definition of communist, I'm like, whoa, right? And people think that they understand all of ideology by going around going, this is a communist, this is a fascist, this is a social democrat. This, just putting labels on things is not understanding the world, right? And that Roosevelt was what he was because of unique historical circumstances and because of communists. Let's back up. 1929, the U.S. economy crashed. Mass hunger, mass unemployment. It was a disaster. And, there was a popular song back then called The Happy Days Are Here Again, and they played it on the radio, and they were convinced, they kept telling everyone that, hey, everything's just going to get better. The depression's going to go away. It's all going to get better. One of these days, the economy will just kind of fix itself. Didn't happen. And Americans were starving in big numbers. I mean, there was malnutrition-related deaths in the United States. People ate dandelions. That was very common back then. People would take dandelions and boil them and eat them in the hopes of getting some nutrients. That's how bad things were back then. People would see dead bodies along the side of the road in the United States, right? From people that had been going from town to town trying to find food and had just collapsed and died. My grandparents talked about those times a little bit to me. It was pretty awful. And it was just, those were just awful times. My grandfather used to always tell the story of, there was a homeless guy who would go from town to town. This was very common back then. As people would lose their homes, they wouldn't be able to pay off their mortgage, and they would just go from town to town looking for any kind of work. And my grandfather used to tell the story. There was a guy who was one of these people, and he came to somebody's house, and he was working out in their yard to get a little bit of money so we could eat something that day. And there was a flock of geese that landed on the lawn. And so the homeless fellow knocked on the door of the house where he was working, and he said to them, there's a flock of geese out here, and my goodness, I could shoot one of these geese, and, I could eat it, and that would be a bigger meal than I've had in a long time. But I don't have a gun. Do you have a gun? The owner of the house said, I have a gun. I have a shotgun, but the first goose you kill is mine. The first goose you kill is mine because it's my gun, this is my house, this is my property. The homeless man says, okay, all right. So, the homeless man goes back outside. The guy who owns the house is sitting inside the house. Boom. Here's one shot. One single shot. And of course, all the geese then fly away. Knock on his door. The man who owns the house opens the door. And there is your homeless man with 2 geese. 2 dead geese in his hands. He says, how did you do that? And he says, I waited until they lined up perfectly. Well, there you go. I mean, this kind of thing actually happened. That's how hungry the man was. He sat there and he waited until he had the perfect shot to kill 2 geese with 1 bullet so he could eat because he was starving, right? I mean, we don't realize, we think things are bad in the United States now. Back then, there was no food stamps. There was no unemployment insurance. There was none of that, right? I mean, people were starving. People were starving. So, the Communist Party organized the unemployed protests that I just talked about. Very big, massive protests. There was another thing called the Bonus March, where veterans marched on Washington to demand their veterans' bonus payments, and some of them got killed. They were camping out on the National Mall, and it was just horrendous, protesting, and then the army was sent in to gas them, and the veterans fought with the military, and it was a communist-led thing. That happened. So Roosevelt, who was the governor of New York, who was from a very wealthy family, was related to the previous President Roosevelt, was elected. And in his speech, he talked about this thing he was going to call the New Deal, the National Recovery Act. The National Industrial Recovery Act was going to fix the economy. And when Roosevelt, got elected the first time, it seemed almost like he was going to be a right-wing Bonapartist figure, right? The symbol of the New Deal was an eagle. All the kids in school had to pledge allegiance, not only to the United States, but to the Blue Eagle. And they outlawed strikes in certain industries. It seemed like a right-wing thing. He did talk against Wall Street bankers. He did pass some initial regulations like Glass-Steagall that prevented, it separated commercial banking from Wall Street stock transactions. It was, that was pretty good. But other than that, Roosevelt kind of seemed like, and he almost seemed right-wing. He seemed kind of anti-union a little bit. He seemed kind of, he almost seemed like he was going to be kind of a right-wing authoritarian. But then in 1934, right? So Roosevelt took office. He was elected in 32. He got elected and took office in 33. He got elected in 32 and took office in 33. 1934, the summer of 1934, was probably one of the most important summers in the American class struggle that we've ever had. In 1934, in San Francisco, which is one of the most important docks on the West Coast, there was a militant strike led by the Communist Party. Right, the dock workers in San Francisco shut the docks down. And it was militant, and they fought the police, and they fought, and it was militant, and they won. They won a union contract, but the whole city of San Francisco was shut down for a couple weeks in a general strike, right, led by the Communist Party. The Communists went in there, they split, they broke their affiliation with the official union, they formed a communist union, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, ILWU, which is still around, still a very radical union with ties to the Communist Party, and they won on the docks. And then in Toledo, Ohio, the Auto Light workers who worked at this factory called Auto Light did the same thing. And they were tied to the Communist Party. They were tied with this other faction called the American Workers' Party, which was kind of like Christian socialist pacifist types. And they also shut the city of Toledo down. Militant stuff, fighting for their lives. The police were, the National Guard was sent in there. The city was shut down for a few weeks. It was crazy. Minneapolis, the Teamsters, which were infiltrated by the Trotskyite communists, did the same thing. And they shut down the city of Minneapolis. They said no scab trucks. And they had guys, out there with baseball bats. And if any truck went by that didn't have a union pass on it, they busted the windows open. Right? It was very, very militant. And they set up speakers all over town. So when you heard the leaders of the union speak, the whole town heard it. And it was like the communists took over Minneapolis, for a couple weeks, and they took over Toledo, Ohio for a couple weeks. They took over San Francisco for a couple weeks. Militant strikes, leading unions, doing really radical stuff. Meanwhile, all throughout the U.S. South, textile workers went on strike, and the only people that were organizing in the South at that point were the Communist Party, communist unions, right? And the National Textile Workers Union in South Carolina and Alabama and other places went on strike, and all textile workers refused to go to work. And these were integrated unions, white and black together, striking, joining arm in arm on the picket line, getting shot at by sheriffs. I mean, it was a very, very extreme radical period. The summer of 1934, it was a particularly hot summer. There were a lot of people that were very, very hungry and unemployed, and on the picket lines, lots of people died, lots of people fought, lots of armed battles going on, lots of workers waving guns around, lots of National Guard being sent in, lots of national state of emergency being declared. It was utter chaos, in the United States. There were uprisings of the working class going on, led by communists all over the country, demanding that people's wages increase, demanding that people be treated better on the job. And so in that context, it's pretty clear there was an attempt to have a fascist coup against Roosevelt. There was what they called the business plot, where J.P. Morgan and the American Legion had conspired to overthrow Roosevelt and establish some kind of military dictatorship. And there was a general named Smedley Butler, Marine Corps general, who blew the whistle. They'd gone to him and said, hey, we're trying to have a conspiracy to overthrow Roosevelt and set up a fascist dictatorship to stop all these communist uprisings. And Smedley Butler blew the whistle, and he told them all. He told it to Congress, and then everyone just tried to laugh it off like it was a crazy conspiracy theory, but everyone knew it happened, right? It was totally true. J.P. Morgan and others. J.P. Morgan and Henry Ford and others were conspiring to set up a fascist dictatorship to stop the spread of communist labor uprisings from taking place across the United States. So in that context, Roosevelt sees not only is there utter chaos and protests and strikes taking place all across the United States, not only is the economy not getting better, but on top of all of that, his own class, the wealthy capitalists, are talking about overthrowing him. So in that context, Franklin Roosevelt turned to the left. That's what happened. So, 1935, Roosevelt passed the first law on a federal level that guaranteed every worker the right to join a union. Right? 1935. It was called the Wagner Act, not the Wagner Act, because this is the United States and we don't pronounce correct German pronunciations. So the Wagner Act of 1935 made it legal to join a union. And it created the National Labor Relations Board that would oversee the legal way of unionizing workplaces. The USA recognized and established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, which you might think, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it had a lot to do with it, because the Communist Party USA, right? The Communist Party USA was big in leading these protests and strikes. The Communist Party was part of the Communist International. So if the USA, with Roosevelt recognizing the USSR, establishing more business and trade with the USSR, that opened some doors to the Communist Party being more friendly to him and cooperating with him. And then on top of that, Roosevelt hired the unemployed workers. He created the National Works Progress Administration, and he hired thousands of unemployed people to start building infrastructure around the country, building roads, building post offices, building schools. So Roosevelt swung left in 1935 and started taking a left swing. So then, of course, immediately he's called a communist. He's a communist, he's, un-American, he's, all of that, right? And a lot of Roosevelt's own Democratic Party turned against him. There was something called the American Liberty League that was formed by Democrats who were against Roosevelt. It was headed by Al Smith, who was the head of the New York City Democratic Party, the Tammany Hall machine, and he gave a speech. He said, "America can have only one capital, Washington or Moscow." And it was, if you were a good Catholic, you had to hate Roosevelt because he was a communist. And, so Roosevelt was kind of under attack even within his own party. So the 1936 election comes in, and Roosevelt is getting ready for a second term. And if you read the rhetoric from Roosevelt's 1936 re-election campaign, he sounded like a socialist. He really did. I mean, the speech he gave in Madison Square Garden, he said, "Never before have I seen Wall Street, so united against a single candidate, but I welcome their hatred," and he sounded like very, very far left. And he was promising he was going to do more, and he talked about capitalism being, the greed of the rich, and he sounded really, really far left. And keep in mind also that Roosevelt, at this point, the right wing had raised more money than him by far. They were trying to drive him out of office. Not only did they have a Republican candidate, but they had this thing called the Union Party that was like pretending to be more far left than him, that was like being funded by Republicans to remove him. They were trying to remove Roosevelt, right? And there were just all kinds of efforts to remove him from office. But Roosevelt, he gave his fireside chats over the radio where he told the Americans what was up, and he just turned on. He started feeding people, and he hired all these unemployed people. He started programs to give people free dental care, summer camps for the kids. He did all kinds of stuff that made him very, very popular. And so 1936, the election came around, and all these corporations said that if Roosevelt got reelected, they would lay people off en masse because he'll raise our taxes and he's un-American and all this. So basically, employers were threatening to basically, if you vote for Roosevelt, you're gonna lose your job. It was like they were all out to stop Roosevelt. Then, in 1936, he won the election by a lot, because people saw him as their champion, right? There's a famous story of a South Carolina textile worker shook hands with Roosevelt and said that he was the first man in the White House to know that his boss was a son of a bitch, right? You're hearing me swear again. It's a quote, right? Textile worker shook Roosevelt's hand and said, "You're the first man in the White House to know that my boss is a son of a bitch." And it was Roosevelt was seen as like the people's champion against the rich and powerful. So he won. And the employers then did what they said they were going to do and started laying people off. And so the Communist Party started doing sit-down strikes, where workers who got fired, who got laid off, would seize the factory and hold all the equipment and all of that hostage. Sit-down strikes. And it started in Akron, Ohio. Then it moved to the Flint sit-down strike, which they called the Gettysburg of Labor, where, and Roosevelt famously sent the military to protect the strikers from the local police. right? The army marched to the factory, and when they got there, the army, the U.S. military, turned around the machine guns. And they were not there to attack the workers. They were there to protect the workers. You know, it was big. Roosevelt got on the radio and gave workers permission to occupy their factories. He said that sit-down strikes were legal. And all over the country, at department stores in New York City, all over the country, workers did it. And they would do it. The Communist Party would say, hey, President Roosevelt says you ought to join the Union. And they did it. And it was 1937, the sit-down strike wave. And all over the country, workers occupied their factories because the President of the United States was giving them permission to do it. And then the Supreme Court said that sit-down strikes were not legal, right? And Roosevelt famously tried to pack the Supreme Court, right? Because he felt, it was big. It was very, very big. And Roosevelt was pretty unstoppable. He was pretty unstoppable during that period, right? Congress accused Roosevelt of being a communist. And he formed this, there was the Young Communist League joined with like some church groups, and they formed this thing called the Congress of the American Youth. And it was an activist youth group that supported Roosevelt, basically. And it was, the leader of it was a guy named Gilbert Green, who was very openly in the Young Communist League. And Eleanor Roosevelt would go and speak at their national gatherings. And all across the country, young people were joining the American Youth Congress, or the Congress of the American Youth. And so Congress investigated it. And so they called Gilbert Green to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which back then was called the Dies Committee because it was led by a Republican congressman from Montana named Martin Dies. And and when Gilbert Green, a leader of the Young Communist League, was called to testify before Congress, they let him sleep over at the White House. A card-carrying Communist Party member, they let him sleep over at the White House. That's how big this was. But here's where it gets weird, okay? Eleanor Roosevelt was anti-racist. She said that Jim Crow was bad. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was not. And Roosevelt totally played ball with Jim Crow segregation, was not anti-racist, right? And that's one thing you have to remember. And the Democrats were always afraid of their relationship with the communists because they were afraid of losing the solid South, right? That the South was Democrats and the South was Jim Crow and racist, and communists opposed Jim Crow and racism. So it was this game that they played where Roosevelt would say he respected the Southern way of life and their traditions, and no one should ever tell them they should have to integrate. And Eleanor would go and give speeches against racism and have black singers perform at White House events. And it was like, well, the two just couldn't see eye to eye. It was BS. It was they were playing them. It was politics, right? But that was going on. And then the other thing that happened was that, that even though Roosevelt was constantly having communist and labor activists come and meet at the White House, in 1939, the Soviet Union had tried to get the United States to join an anti-fascist alliance as World War II was getting going. And they wouldn't do it. So in the fall of 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, right? And the Trotskyite, and because Nazi Germany was an enemy of the United States, many people in the United States saw that as proof that the communists were no good. Time magazine started calling the Communist Party the Communazis. The Trotskyites would make fun of the Soviet Union. They even had a song, up in Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the fall of 39, there's a Russian and a Prussian riding up the party line. I mean, and it was like, they were constantly, and Roosevelt, at that point, he turned against the Communist Party. He sent Earl Browder to federal prison and framed him up. It was a passport violation, but it was nonsense. Earl Browder went to federal prison, right? He imprisoned Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party. He, and the communists that had been Roosevelt's most loyal friends started picketing the White House and having anti-war rallies, at the White House. They had all these people gather in Washington, D.C. and swear they would never support the U.S. government no matter what war it was. And after the 1939 Pact, until Pearl Harbor, the Communist Party and the White House were enemies, right? I mean, the 1940 campaign of the Communist Party, they ran against Roosevelt. They called Roosevelt a warmonger. It was pretty crazy, right? And it was a mess. Well, then World War II broke out. And the communists supported the Second World War. They let Earl Browder out of prison. And the Communist Party became an essential part of the U.S. military machine during the Second World War. And there was a no-strike pledge. And, the communists enforced the no-strike pledge. And they even worked with the FBI to report people in the labor unions who were trying to strike and break the no-strike pledge. And the communists were loyal supporters of Roosevelt when the Second World War happened. Now, what's also important is that, during the Second World War, the USA functioned almost like a military dictatorship. Most industries were being told by the government what they could and could not produce. And the Roosevelt apparatus grew very, very strong, right? And, there was Japanese internment, very ugly, very awful, but, the Communist Party supported that, and Roosevelt, made no apologies for doing it, horrendous thing. But the USA also during that time, it was the industries were all being told what to produce for the war, and the Communist Party. And before he died, during the Second World War, Roosevelt died, and he continued to repeat this phrase, this understanding that he said that fascism is the result of hungry stomachs, and that the only way to defend democracy was to make sure people had what they needed. That was like a theme in all of his speeches, that Hitler was the result of poverty, that poverty and unemployment had created Hitler. And Roosevelt, in his final years, advocated that after the Second World War, the USA and the Soviet Union would be allies. That was one of his big things. And he also advocated a second Bill of Rights, guaranteeing every American the right to a job, the right to housing, all kinds of stuff. So, at that point, what would have happened? Now, Roosevelt died, right, as the Second World War was coming to an end. At just the perfect time, by the way, right? Roosevelt died. And Truman, raving anti-communist, had briefly been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was from Missouri. He came in, and that was the end of the Roosevelt coalition, right? And McCarthyism was the Democrats purging the Roosevelt Democrats out of there. And, but Roosevelt was a Bonapartist figure. He was aligned with the Rockefellers primarily, the oil capitalists, but he was aligned with them, and he suppressed the industrial capitalists. And in order to do that, he made an alliance with the Communist Party, and he was becoming more and more left-wing. And there was kind of a block developing within the U.S. government, and it seemed like, if Roosevelt had lived, he very well could have been forced into a situation where so much of the capitalist class was against him, and he so much relied on the strength of the working class that he moved toward advocating actual socialism. He never said he believed in socialism. He said that he was trying to save American capitalism, but in order to do it, he entered an alliance with socialists and communists, and not just domestically, but also internationally. That's what Roosevelt was. And he did awful things like play ball with Jim Crow segregation, like intern the Japanese. In the early years of his presidency, he was a union buster. But class forces, right, forced him as a Bonapartist figure into an alliance. That's how revolutions tend to happen. Revolutions begin with struggles within the capitalist class, when the capitalists are fighting amongst themselves and the working class is desperate, and that's how revolutions happen. Read Lenin, right? The revolutions don't happen out of the air. They don't just happen. It's not like one day people just wake up. No. And it's also not that people just become convinced. They read enough socialist leaflets get passed out that enough people read it. And no. Revolutions happen as the result of material conditions and as the result of capitalism breaking down. And capitalism in the United States was breaking down. There were big divisions in the ruling class. Roosevelt was being threatened by his own class. He entered an alliance with the working class. He entered an alliance with the Soviet Union. Things were developing in one way very rapidly, and they stopped developing that way after the end of the Second World War. Let's be real, right? The circumstances that had created Roosevelt went away. Pretty soon the U.S. economy was booming again. The world was kind of reshuffled by, almost every major city in outside the United States in the Western world being blown up, right? A war that kills millions of people tends to, and destroys most of the industrialized world tends to shake things up. But anyway, shout out to Terry Wright. Glad you're with us, Terry. Glad you're with us, Orga Mecca. I'm going on about Roosevelt. I'd planned to talk about that, and somebody asked about it, so it was like the perfect storm. But what else is on people's minds today? What else is going on? How are people doing this summer? Tell me what else is on your minds. What do you think of propaganda of the deed, says Bob. I don't like it. It's ultra-left. It's adventurous. It's a silly concept. It comes out of the new left, the situationists in France and all of that, and it's problematic. I don't like it as a concept, and I think that's the problem. I think it's a middle-class deviation, and no, I mean, you know, no. Isolated acts of adventurous activity don't accomplish anything. They don't help anybody, and I'm opposed to that kind of thing. But thanks for asking, Bob. People are asking me about the problems of Western leftism that I rant and rave about all day long. I probably shouldn't talk about that. People ask me, do I think a red-brown alliance is possible? No, that's something that's always thrown at people. You know, it's like, you know, I think that there are a lot of people that are confused nowadays, and that the word fascism is being thrown around so liberally. And I mean, I explained what fascism actually is early in this live, when I was telling the story about the wolf and all of that. And there may be people who advocate more nationalistic economics, people that may not be politically correct, that socialists are able to unite with, but the actual fascist element, you know, the lynch mob element, no alliance with them is ever possible. You know, but there you go. And I don't like the way the word fascism is being completely thrown around lately. There's a lot of people who maybe they're nationalistic, maybe they're conservative, maybe they're right-wing, maybe they're authoritarian. They're not fascists. Fascism is pretty clear what it is, right? It's blood and terror, right? And that's, you know, people that just, you know, don't agree, that don't have the correct line, or they just break the rules. You know, there's all these rules on the left. You can't say America, or you have to say United States. You know, I mean, you know, and if you don't play by these rules, you're a fascist. Oh, you're a fascist. You're a fascist. Well, you know, it's silliness, right? And this is the left isolating itself from society at large. This is the left doing its best to try and, you know, just be an isolated group of people that feel heroic and feel like they're persecuted and feel like they don't fit in with the rest of society. And it's kind of sad. And yeah, I mean, that's what that is. And no, I mean, I think fascism is a real problem, but I don't. You know, I mean, the way it's being thrown around, all this hype, oh, red-brown alliance, oh my God, are you a fascist? You know, it's silliness. It's simply the hype about the red-brown alliance more than anything nowadays is an attempt to isolate anyone on the left who takes genuinely anti-imperialist positions. That's really what it is. It's certain voices that want to work, that are working really hard to try and make it so anyone who is a leftist that doesn't support war and doesn't support covert operations to overthrow governments, if you do that, we try to make you a pariah on the left by convincing everyone that you're a fascist. That's what's going on, and it's stupid, and it's not going to work either, because the left historically, most people historically that believe in socialism have been anti-imperialist, right? That it's the reason we wage these wars is for capitalism, and that imperialism at this point is trying to give itself a socially liberal cover in a lot of countries. It attacks countries, says it's the champion of LGBT people, or says it's the champion of women's rights, or says that the leader is a racist or something like that, and that because the Cold War is over, because things are more ideologically confused, the imperialists position themselves in a socially liberal and modestly almost centrist left way. And also, a lot of anti-imperialists present themselves to their populations as defenders of stability. And part of stability means the traditional family. It means traditional social ideas and such. And so it's complicated. The politics of imperialism and anti-imperialism are complicated, but that doesn't mean that there's a red-brown alliance, right? And that's, you know, that's absurd, and that's just the way. That's a way that a lot of these elements, they're trying to isolate people. They're trying to make a situation where if you're on the left, you're compelled to support U.S. government operations in Syria, compelled to support U.S. government operations to overthrow the government of China, and if you don't, you're considered a Nazi and you're banned from social circles. And that's what they want to do. That's basically what they want to do. And they're failing, and they won't succeed. What else is on people's minds here? What else is on people's minds? What's going on? What's new? What's new? What's happening? I'm looking at people's questions. Well, here's something that's on my mind, folks. So, Argentina has been under the dominion of this, this Macri government, right? The Kirchner social democratic Peronist government was forced out, and Macri, who is a believer in Western capitalism, who brought Argentina back into the IMF, has been wrecking the economy of Argentina the whole time. I mean, it's been getting worse and worse and worse, the economy of Argentina. And the U.S. media never seems to make that connection. It's like, oh, Argentina's currency crashed. Well, okay, well, it crashed. I mean, whatever. I mean, it's like they never, whenever there was any problem in Argentina under Kirchner, it was Kirchner's fault. And now under Macri, the economy has been crashing and burning, and they're just like, well, yeah, whatever. So now they had the first round of the election, and Fernandez and Kirchner won in big numbers because people realized their economy is crashing because of free market policies. And so now, all of a sudden, there was a big downturn on the stock. Oh, look, the Kirchner's dead. It's ridiculous. It's really, really ridiculous, right? Yes, there's going to be a big political and economic shift in the country if Fernandez and Kirchner get into office. Why? They're going to stop the deregulation and the gutting and the privatizations that have wrecked Argentina's economy over the last few years. So yes, so the Wall Street people panicked, right? It's like they're so apt to blame socialism for any problem. And then when capitalism screws up and destroys whole countries, they just, what? I didn't notice, right? All throughout the 1990s. Folks, I went to Ecuador when I was 12 years old. And that was the time when Ecuador was doing everything that Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand and Alan Greenspan said was the right thing. They even gave up their own currency and adopted the US dollar as their currency. And I was in Ecuador in 1999. I was a child, I was a teen, but I had never seen that level of poverty in my life. People starving, people desperately poor. And all throughout Latin America in the 1990s, that was the reality. Bolivia, Venezuela, the poverty was extreme. People were in mass suffering and dying. All these kind of Bonapartist regimes that the USA had kind of tolerated, these military dictatorships had kind of tolerated during the Second World War, during the Cold War, that had some level of economic stabilization. They were just replacing them with austerity regimes all over Latin America, everywhere. Brazil, all over Latin America, they were just replacing the military dictatorships with elected austerity governments that were just gutting everything left and right. People were starving, and I never had seen that level of poverty. And when I returned to Ecuador in 2013, after Rafael Correa, in coalition with the Communist Party, had been in office, I saw a completely different country. I saw paved roads. I didn't see a single homeless person the whole time I was there. I did see an old lady who was walking around selling, cigarettes, and maybe she was homeless, but I don't think she was. I think it was just her, something she did to make money, and she was, old and rather poor, but other than that, I kept thinking, is this the same country I went to when I was 12 years old? But it had been completely transformed by socialism, right? By the Correa government that was moving towards socialism, right? I was on the road to socialism. It hadn't fully gotten there, and now it's being dismantled by Lenin Moreno, unfortunately. But what Bolivarian socialism did in Ecuador was amazing. But the whole time in the 1990s, when all over Latin America, all over Eastern Europe, free market policies were gutting and destroying countries, nobody in the U.S. media ever noticed, ever. And when Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez first came in there and was raising living standards and things were, going up and they were eliminating poverty, nobody in U.S. media noticed. Nobody ever noticed. And now that Venezuela's having its difficulties, oh my God, see, socialism failed. And meanwhile, in Bolivia, the other hardline revolutionary government in Bolivia, Evo Morales, is presiding over the highest GDP growth rate in all of South America for the last several years, right? and the government controls the means of production, and people are rising out of poverty. Economic growth is happening everywhere, and no one ever says, oh, socialism. No, they just pretend it doesn't exist. But I can guarantee you, if things start going bad in Bolivia, all of a sudden it'll be, oh, look, socialism. I mean, it's so selective. Everything is selective. People right now in Haiti, I mean, there were riots going on over the price of gasoline. People were starving and desperate. Never blame it on capitalism. We have proof of capitalism's failure right on our border. Every day these refugees are piling in. Are they coming from Nicaragua? No, they are not. They're not coming from Nicaragua. They're coming from Honduras, a country whose socialist leader was overthrown in a violent military coup, and they've had free market policies for since 2009, for over a decade. They're coming from Guatemala, another country that's lived under free market policies, right? I mean, nobody. Look at Mexico. They've been in the back pocket of the United States for so long, right? And the drug cartel. No one ever says that's because of capitalism. I mean, it's such a ridiculous lie through omission. Facts don't matter in the way that they cover these things, right? The achievements of socialist governments are ignored, the failures of capitalism are ignored, and anything that confirms this Cold War stupid narrative these people have in their head. And then you argue with them, and then they insist that all the capitalist countries of Latin America are all socialist, right? I mean, you get on Twitter, and they're like, Mexico's a communist country, right? And Guatemala's a communist country. That's all they've got, right? Because they're liars. I mean, and people just want to believe. They're so determined to believe that the capitalism is good, but history shows the opposite, right? If it weren't for socialism, Russia and China wouldn't be superpowers right now. I mean, it's ridiculous, but you all know that because you watch these lives pretty regularly. I'm having a great time here. What else is on people's minds? What else is new? What else is happening? Well, yes, I am going to be speaking in Rhode Island on Thursday, September 5th. There's a coffee shop, cafe out in Rhode Island. I've been invited. There's a fellow out there by the name of Joel. Great guy I've had the privilege of interacting with. And it's near Brown University at Providence, Rhode Island, this cafe. And I'm going to be giving a presentation there about the new book. So you should be there. I will be there. And it's going to be fun. I think you ought to go. Now, Ray is saying I should run for president. Well, that's really sweet of you, Ray. I appreciate that. But yeah, I mean, if you can make it to Rhode Island on September 5th, I'm going to be there, and it'll be fun. Hope you can make it. Should be a fun evening for all. I'm going to talk about the new book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. It's a great book. In fact, I think I'm just pushing you back here so you can see my whole bookshelf. Now, yeah, right. The right winger I debated, Augustus Sol Invictus, is running for president. So if you want to see why his ideas are completely wrong and see him ideologically destroyed, watch the debate I did with him. And Julian Assange was very impressed by that debate. He actually shared it on Twitter. There you go. Someone named Yuri was saying something, and then I saw it go by. But it's gonna be great. I'm having a great time. We're doing great stuff here. Folks, I just, sanctions on Iran. Okay. The sanctions on Iran. You can talk about the oil price and how Trump is doing his best to try to keep the oil price from dropping, but. Folks, right, Iranians can't get medical care because of these sanctions. The medical imports from Europe to Iran have decreased by 25 to 30%. There's been a 67% drop in medical imports to Iran. I mean, all right, so if you believe all the U.S. government media propaganda, and you think the Iranian government is the spawn of Satan, you hate the Iranians, back up for a minute. Why do Iranian people deserve to die just because their government is a government that you don't like? I mean, I can't understand why does Iran not have the right to buy medicine? Right? Why can't the Iranian people get medicine? I mean, these sanctions that they are imposing on them are absolutely crazy. I did a story about how, like, the U.S. government has had these media broadcasts, BBC Persian or Voice of America Persian, broadcasting their propaganda into Iran. But, like, it's gotten nuts, right? I mean, the broadcasts have become so partisan. They're attacking people who used to work there as being, like, traitors and agents of Iran. I did a story on it earlier this week. I mean, the anti-Iran stuff is getting stupid. It's really getting stupid, right? Trump is really desperate to keep that Netanyahu faction, the Likud faction in Israel, on his side. And it's getting really, really stupid. It's really scary because I've been to Iran. I made a whole documentary in Iran that was shown on Iranian TV. Iran's it's a progressive government. It's not capitalism, but Islam, anti-imperialist. They have programs there. They care for people. There's a street in Iran named after Bobby Sands. There's pictures of Malcolm X very prominently displayed in Iran. In Iran, they make sure that people have jobs. They built huge amounts of infrastructure. It is an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist government. It's Islamic. It's very socially conservative, but people don't know the first thing. Everything that you think is true about Iran is true about Saudi Arabia. Women have always been able to drive in Iran. Women have always been able to vote in Iran. They have women generals in the Iranian army, brigadier generals in the Iranian army, right? I went to Iran. I saw posters and photographs of women in hijab and, the whole black thing with AK rifles, shooting, Iran is not what you think. All the stereotypes you have of some primitive country where they whack people's heads off in public and they have an absolute authoritarian dictatorship, that's Saudi Arabia. That's Saudi Arabia. Everything you think about Iran is actually true about Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia are big friends with Western capitalism. They love Western capitalism. They wouldn't even be in power if it weren't for Western capitalism. The Arab people are not primitive barbarians. They're not, right? These are people that when my ancestors and your ancestors were living in caves in Europe, these people are having the Islamic Enlightenment, and we're doing things in mathematics that had never been done before, right? The Persians, they're not Arabs, they're Persians. They are, also have an amazing history. You can talk about King Cyrus. You can talk about some of the achievements that went on, the Zarathustra and all of that, and Zoroastrianism. And, the Middle East is a region, and Saudi Arabia is not what the Arab people naturally are, right? The Arab people are a brilliant people. They made great strides and advances. Saudi Arabia was a regime, the House of Saud was selected to rule over the Arabian Peninsula by British imperialism, right? And, the Persians, the Arabs, these are a people that have an amazing history of civilization and achieving great things. A lot of city building went on in the Middle East throughout history, and it's the Vandals of empire that have torn it down and have kept these countries in poverty. And I really think it's a tragedy that, I know Iraq under Saddam Hussein and the Soviet Union were talking at one point about actually bringing irrigation to the Middle East. Kid you not, there were big conferences in the Middle East about building, irrigation and bringing water from the North Pole down through the Soviet Union to the Middle East, so that the Middle East could start growing food and could stop being the oil reserves of the rest of the world. It could stop being a one-commodity economy. Gaddafi in Libya, he built the great man-made river to try and get Libya out of the trap of being a one-commodity economy, right? And that economic development is what that region very badly needs. And the imperialists have worked very, very hard to keep the people of the Middle East divided, to keep them desperately poor, and to keep them basically functioning as oil vassals, as little oil plantations, right? The Sykes-Picot Agreement that we know about because of the Bolsheviks. It was the Bolsheviks that made public the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the imperialists after World War I had divided up the Middle East, and here's Syria, here's Jordan, here's Iraq, they did it. right? Those borders were drawn up by the imperialists. They divided the Arab people, who are one nation. There's one Arab nation. There's a Persian nation in Iran. And they divided up the Arab world in order to control it and subjugate it and divide up the loot among the imperialists. And that's just something that no one can deny. But yeah, and it's a tragedy. It really is. It really is a tragedy. Edward Said has that book Orientalism, that talks about the way the Middle East is viewed by Westerners. I think that's particularly interesting. I would recommend it. But just so much of everything we hear about the Middle East and all these countries in the world is just false. I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions, and it's really tragic. It really, really is. These right-wingers get all anti-Islamic, and it's like the most reactionary Wahhabi forces are the ones supported by the West. The people that the United States attacks in the Middle East tend to be the most progressive, the most westernizing, the most industrializing, the people building infrastructure, right? The Iranian government. I've seen with my own eyes, I've seen, well, anyway, someone's asking me about the role of the Putin government in Russia. And I got to tell you, the Putin government, the way that they fixed the economy was by the creation of national champions. Read Vladimir Putin's doctoral dissertation. He realized that it was free market deregulation that was causing Russia to have all the problems it was having during the 1990s. Fact. And from there, he developed a mechanism for saving Russia's economy by having state control over oil and gas, and controlling the economy and centering the economy around the state, and the state funding itself through oil and gas. And it seems to have worked pretty well. I mean, there's Russia has its problems like any other country, but the Putin government has done a huge amount to raise people up out of poverty, to control the economy, and to get out of the disaster of the 1990s. And that's been done with government control over oil and gas. So, I hope that answers your question, Proletarian Center. People are asking about Karl Marx, and, whatever. Marx's words speak for themselves. You can decide. You read what Marx said. I mean, I don't know. Some of the early essays are pretty weird. But yeah, I mean, I think around the world, the USA loves poor countries. When countries stay poor, when they don't have their own infrastructure, when they don't have their own industries, when they have to buy everything from us, they're full of chaos and drug gangs and poverty, the USA gets along with them great. But when a government takes power that says, no, we are not going to be impoverished, we are going to stand up and fight for ourselves, and we're going to do the American thing, right? And pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We are going to come together as a nation and build a better country. When that happens, then Wall Street goes, oh, no, you don't. This is a dictatorship. This is communism. This is fascism. This is authoritarianism. Oh, my God, they're threatening freedom. That's what happens. That's how it works, folks. That's how it works. The USA loves, during the Cold War, the United States loved these kind of Bonapartist military states that suppressed communist revolution. Cold War's over. Now they want democratic, weak, pathetic governments. That's what they want. They want governments that are weak, pathetic, and democratic. Right? They want governments that don't do shit. That's what they want. They want weak governments. They want governments that just kind of come in there and go, I guess we have a big narco trafficking problem in this country. Oh boy. Can't do anything about it. They want governments that come in there and go, a lot of unemployment here. Oh, shit. Oh, vote for us next time. They want weak, pathetic governments. That's what they want. And they like it being democratic because democratic governments, right, can always blame it on they don't like strong governments. That's what they don't like. They don't like strong governments at this point. That's what they don't like. And when somebody comes into office like Putin and he says, all right, I am tired of seeing Russians get robbed by the international bankers. I'm tired of seeing my people in poverty. We're going to create Gazprom. We're going to create Rosneft, and we're going to raise people up out of poverty. They hate it. Oh, dictator, right? when they see a leader like President Xi come in there and say, whoa, this corruption has gotten out of control. This is a socialist country here in China. No, you can't be taking bribes. And we're gonna start talking about Mao again. We're gonna start talking communism again. And we're gonna start enforcing the law against these big corporations. And they see him and they go, oh, he's a Stalinist dictator. I mean, it's the same story, the same old story, right? In Bolivia, right? When a leader like Evo Morales comes in and they says that we need the government to build infrastructure, we need to raise people out of poverty, they say, dictator, extreme. This is how it works. They want weak, pathetic, loser governments. That's what they want. And the second you have a government of action that fights for the people, by using state power, by doing what governments have always done, statecraft. That's what governments do. The science of statecraft. Governments come in and mobilize the people to advance human civilization. And when that happens, when governments actually govern, then it's a dictatorship. Right? It's supposed to be a de facto dictatorship. That's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be the dictatorship of Wall Street corporations. It's supposed to be the de facto dictatorship they call democracy, where big corporations rule and the government is weak and pathetic and can't get in their way. But when governments come in that actually govern and actually start feeding people and actually start enforcing the law and caring for people and raising living standards and, advancing people and making people smarter and providing education, when governments like that come in, they scream dictatorship because it's getting in the way of the dictatorship that's already there. And they don't like it. That's what's going on there. Remember, interesting conversation. I was in Iran. I sat down with a cleric, an Islamic cleric. He and I chatted, and there's like a video somewhere. They filmed like everything when I was in Iran. I sat down with an Islamic cleric, and he was explaining to me the Islamic system. He was explaining to me that, in Iran, we're not a totally democratic country. He was honest. He said, we're not a totally democratic country. We're not. And he said, neither is America. He says, but in America, you claim to be totally democratic, but everyone knows that your democracy is basically guided and controlled by Wall Street bankers and capitalism. In Iran, we don't claim to be a democracy. We have elections, we have democratic elements, but we make sure that the democracy is guided by the Islamic Revolution. Honesty. Right? Iran is democratic, it has free elections, but it has the Guardian Council that makes sure that the democracy flows in the tradition of the Islamic Revolution. In the United States, we claim pure democracy. It's, just free democracy, but everybody knows, at the end of the day, the rich people all make sure that nothing comes in that challenges their power. Right? They can't even stand Trump. They think Trump is challenging their power. He ain't. Right? But even he is too strong for them. Right? And that's what people don't get. Democracy, actual democracy, like true democracy is only possible with socialism. And even early stages of socialism don't really have it. Right? True democracy is only possible when the population is so well empowered that they are brought into the political process. When people are more and more brought in, when people start to rule themselves, you can start to have democracy. And then even democracy itself can fade away. Right? I mean, that's the ultimate vision of Marxism, is a society that is so much freedom, so much material abundance that people can just kind of do what they want and do what they feel like doing. Right? From each according to his own ability to each according to his needs. And that is only possible, that's really only possible, in which there is such a huge level of material abundance. There's no poverty, there's no want. People all just have what they need. And so why would you need a state to enforce things, right? But society becomes more and more democratic, the more stable it becomes, and the more material abundance there is, and when class contradictions fade away, we'll start to see the beginnings of true democracy under socialism. And eventually, I think, as socialism develops, democracy itself will fade away. But until then, any talk of democracy is a little bit facetious, right? Civil liberties, yes. In Western countries, we have a higher standard of civil liberties because the society is more stable. There's a higher level of economic development. But these countries are not pure democracies. We know that. They're guided democracies. They're just guided by capital. And countries around the world that are building socialism have an element of democracy. People in the workplace get to vote and all of that, but they're not purely democratic. They're guided by the leaders of their revolution. But that's the way it is, right? But democracy is something to be aspired to. It's a good thing. Human rights are a good thing. Democracy is a good thing, but the only way to get there is to get countries out of poverty, to get countries out of the trap of Western capitalism. And all across the developing world, and even in the Western world, there's this illusion that as long as everyone gets to vote, it's a democracy. And it's not, right? The de facto rule of wealth is not democracy. And just because, it's the de facto rule of wealth, doesn't mean it's democracy. And that's the biggest lie. Just because, the rich people, it's not democracy. And that's what these folks don't get. That it doesn't become a pure democracy when the rich and powerful make all the decisions. But hey, what do I know? I'm just rambling on and on here. I think democracy is a great thing. And I think that the more democratic a country can be, the better. But democracy depends on citizen involvement, and it depends on an abolition of class contradiction. But there we go. I'm having a great time here, folks. We're talking about all kinds of stuff. Yeah. Oh boy. Well, folks, I'm having a great time here. I guess I'll just end by saying I'm not running for president, as Ray would like me to. But if I did, my campaign slogan would be, I bet you all can guess, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. I'm not running for president. If I was, that slogan would be everywhere, and that would be the slogan I was running on. And I would promise you that I will not be a government that governs least by governing best. I would be a government of action. I would have the kind of government that brought us the music of Bach and Beethoven. I would have the kind of government that brought us the brilliance of writers like Sir Thomas More, right? The Renaissance began when governments throughout feudal Europe began to shift how they understood interacting with people, and they became governments of action. And no longer was it simply that people had obligations to their quote-unquote natural superiors. Rather, it became this understanding that the government had an obligation to serve the people. That's in the Treaty of Westphalia, to serve the people, populism. If you read the Treaty of Westphalia, read it. Great stuff. In the Treaty of Westphalia, there was an understanding that the governments had an obligation to serve the people. And I would revive the science of statecraft in the United States. I would begin to move toward creating a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Now, more than ever, we need a government of action to fight for working families. So badly we need a government of action to fight for working families. And because I think it's poetic more than anything, I'll end the way I've been ending my last few lives. Before I do that, those of you that are with us, I know about half of you haven't subscribed. Not half, about a fifth of you haven't subscribed. So hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you can get reminders of these upcoming lives. I know some of you haven't even gotten the updates, so I'm concerned about that. So be sure to hit that button. Make sure that you get the notifications. Be sure to subscribe. Be sure to tweet this out. Be sure to let other people see this. Make this a bigger conversation. Come to Rhode Island and see me speak to the students at that community cafe, September 5th, 7 p.m. And remember that ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat that aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. One more time. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously launching Revolutionary war is to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And on that note, I'm out. Have a lovely day. Best wishes.